Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming on this lovely sunny day in Oxford. It's been quite a conference. I've loved it. I'm sure all of you have as well. My name is John Golden. I'm a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist. Can you hear all right at the back? Is the mic working? Great. I've worked at Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is a big paediatric hospital in central London, for about 21 years. I actually left the NHS a few months ago to work in the independent sector, which gives me the opportunity to come to great conferences like this. I do have an interest in social media and in public education around child mental health issues. I've done quite a bit of TV and radio work over the years, and I have a role with the Royal College of Psychiatrists advocating for children with mental health difficulties and trying to improve services, talking to politicians and others, although the current lot of politicians are not very easy to talk to, but that's another story. I might make reference to that at some point during the talk. It's a real honor to be here, obviously. It's lovely, beautiful surroundings. I am aware, a couple of the speakers have mentioned that there's a dark side to this place as well, the colonial history. I think it's very life-affirming to be in such a beautiful room, but I think it's also important to remember some of the dark aspects of the history. And it's a little bit like social media, perhaps. You know, there are good and bad sides. There's a shadow side, and I don't want this talk to come across as, you know, social media is a bad thing, because I don't think that's the case. But I do think that we all need to be a lot more aware of what is out there as parents, as adults, as clinicians, and I think a lot of us aren't as aware as we should be, including myself, and I've been sort of researching this a little bit and learning more about it in the last few years, and I've been quite shocked some of what I've discovered and heard about. I've got 2 teenage daughters, so that's partly the motivation for learning about it, but obviously as a clinician working with children and teenagers, it's very important that we are aware of what's out there online. This is a trauma conference, obviously, and I want to say that I will be making reference to some, difficult themes of suicide and self-harm, abuse, eating disorders, and other things. So please, obviously, look after yourself in any way that you need to. Okay, so the title of the talk is The Risks and Benefits of Social Media for the Mental Health of Adolescents. I'm just going to switch off my phone so it doesn't go off during the talk. And I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the wider context that we live in, how widespread social media is, the prevalence of social media. I'm going to sort of scatter the talk with a couple of clinical examples from my clinical practice. DSH stands for deliberate self-harm, so I am going to be talking about self-harm, eating disorders such as anorexia nervosa, and the links between eating disorders and online material. Safeguarding and child protection issues are important to think about, so we'll cover that a little bit. And I also want to talk about some possible solutions and positive examples of what's out there online. There is some really useful information online in terms of psychoeducation and so on. So I will definitely be talking about that too before we conclude. We've got an hour for this talk and workshop, and I definitely want to leave time for questions and answers at the end. So that probably looks pretty familiar. Teenagers on their phone could apply to all of us in this room, I'm sure, as well. Headphones in, looking at our phones. It's a very widespread sight. And, the internet pervades our society, really. Teenagers these days seem to be very into Snapchat and Instagram particularly. Facebook is for old people like me and some of the audience, according to most teenagers. And, there's LinkedIn and there's all sorts of things. But the ones that teenagers seem to be particularly into at the moment are Snapchat and Instagram. And TikTok, of course, TikTok. TikTok massively increased during the pandemic, and people really, enjoying sharing videos. And, there was an upside to that people could stay in touch with each other during the pandemic and enjoy sharing material. But there was also quite a downside, which we will talk a little bit about. For example, on TikTok, I have a colleague at Great Ormond Street who works with Tourette's and kids with tics, and there's been a huge increase in functional tics, which is directly related, I think, to images of people sharing videos on TikTok of them having their episodes, their tic episodes, or saying that they've got Tourette's when maybe they haven't actually got Tourette's. They might be displaying functional tics, but that's something we can maybe come back to in the discussion. Here's a family. My kids are older than that, but all all ages get very into their phones and their iPads and so on, and of course it's really important that families, wherever possible, interact face-to-face and talk to each other face-to-face, as well as sitting around in that rather characterized picture. I mean, one particular thing is around meal times. I think we as adults and parents need to be really aware that we're not looking at our phones during meal times, and that we have face-to-face interaction. There's been plenty of research showing that that face-to-face communication is protective for young people's mental health. So why do children use social media? They use it for communication, obviously. I used to run an inpatient unit for over 20 years at Great Ormond Street. That was for kids with eating disorders and functional problems, as well as a range of other problems. But we weren't very keen on them having access to their smartphone. We went up to age 14. And we said they could use a sort of old brick phone, and they could use the internet during their free time, a couple of hours a day. They could use iPads that we provided for them, but it was, with a firewall, and it would be a disaster if they started taking photos of each other in hospital and posting them online, and it would be even more of a disaster if they accessed really unhealthy material while they were under our care. So that's how we managed it. But we were working with young people up to age 14. I have colleagues who work on adolescent inpatient units who take a slightly different approach, because they're working with up to 18-year-olds, and people need to obviously learn how to manage these things responsibly for themselves. But it is a bit of a minefield, how you manage that. And some teenagers sort of feel almost like their right arm is being cut off if you take away their smartphone, and they feel they can't communicate with people that they really need to communicate with and are communicating with on a sort of minute-by-minute basis. So, that's one aspect of the communication. But of course, there's lots of positive aspects of communication online. Self-esteem, people post things and they get positive feedback, and they like that, obviously. Of course, that's a two-sided coin, and people worry if they don't get more than, if they get less than 100 likes on Instagram and things like that. So, the bar is set pretty high for some young people, and they can feel quite devastated if there's, a comment that is critical in some way. And teenagers, young people, adults too, can be cruel online. And sometimes one is more cruel, behind a keyboard or behind your phone than you are face-to-face. So that's something to think about as well. Self-expression, people express themselves online, can be very creative, stuff that's posted online. Confidence, popularity. My daughter went to Reading Festival recently, and she seemed to know a lot of people who were there, like friends of friends of friends. Not necessarily people that she'd met, but she said, I'm going to go and meet such and such's friend who I haven't met in real life, but I know them from Instagram. So, it's kind of quite a good way of meeting people in that sense. But of course, there's a shadow side to that. Entertainment. People, they scroll through their screens. YouTube has a lot of interesting stuff on it, and actually when you look at the research, YouTube has quite a lot of educational material. Quite a lot of schools use YouTube. Some of the speakers at this conference are on YouTube, and we'll go and watch their videos afterwards, perhaps. So there's a lot of, really useful stuff online like that. And in terms of teenagers accessing this social media, YouTube is perhaps one of the more positive ones, research suggests. And a sense of belonging. So this sense of belonging, again, it's got kind of two sides to it. On the one hand, you might feel, if you're on the autism spectrum, you're neurodiverse, for example, you might have quite a big degree of social anxiety. You can connect with other people online and really, share your challenges, get support from others. That can be a really positive thing. I'm going to also be talking about some of the really negative sides of that when you meet another person with anorexia and you've got anorexia and they encourage you to be a better anorexic, in inverted commas. So we'll talk about that. So this sense of belonging, as I'm saying, has two sides to it. And to keep up and receive information. I mean, I'm quite active on Twitter. That's my poison of choice, shall we say. But, it's a really good way of keeping up to date with what's going on politically in news and with your colleagues and so on. So it can be a very good way of keeping up and receiving information. And most young people get their news via Instagram and TikTok, actually, these days. They're not watching TV or listening to the radio, the news. They're getting it online. This is just a small survey from 2 or 3 years ago, the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. And this is self-report, and it's just over 100 children. But it just gives you a kind of idea. And you can imagine that when young people self-report, they're probably underestimating to quite a large extent. But children and young people told us that in a typical day, this is what they spend online. 2.5 hours on a computer, laptop, or tablet, maybe 3 hours on their phone, I think my kids probably spend more than 3 hours on their phone per day. You know, I think that's an underestimate, and these figures are going up all the time as well. And 2 hours watching TV. Just gives you an idea from one recent survey. Just talking about some of the trends, I've already alluded to this. Instagram amongst teenagers is very popular, very large user numbers. Snapchat, you'll remember about that, that people felt that they could send images, even sexual images, and then they disappear, so they sort of felt like that might be safe for them to do that. But of course, you can screenshot that. I've come across many examples, unfortunately, where boys have pressurized their girlfriends to send them a nude. If you really loved me, you'd send me a picture of yourself naked, and then they show their mates, and then it can go, spread online, and it's very humiliating and upsetting. So, education about this amongst teenagers is really, really important. But Snapchat can give you this kind of false sense of security because it disappears, but of course you can screenshot it. I've already talked about TikTok and Twitter. Facebook, it's uncool because it's pointless for old people. WhatsApp, very widely used, good way of communicating in groups. YouTube. I mean, this is some of the jargon that's out there. So streaks, people try and maintain streaks. So they send a message on Snapchat, and then they need to get a message back. And then if they don't respond within a certain time, the streak, gets broken. So they feel pressurized to keep doing that backwards and forwards. I've come across stories where, a young person is going somewhere where they might not be online for a while. They might be going on holiday somewhere where the Wi-Fi is not so good. And so they might even ask one of their friends to keep the streak going. And these social media companies, they provide you with balloons and colorful glitter and all sorts of things that come through on your phone when you hit a certain number of streaks. And I'm going to be talking about the addictive quality of social media, how these companies really try and draw us in. A deep like is when you maybe like something. This is teenage slang, but it's when you like something maybe 24 hours after it was posted, which is really a faux pas. If you're going to like something, like it immediately, or like it within a few minutes. Don't. If you do it 24 hours later, you're really not. You need to get with the program. Ghosting is when you don't reply, and this happens. Teenagers in relationships, they feel like they're connecting with someone, and then they don't hear from them again, and obviously that can be upsetting for adults as well. And emojis, one teenager said more than 3 are seen as a little immature nowadays. So I tell my mother, who's in her 80s, who likes sending about 10 emojis, and she can't quite see what they are sometimes. More than three is not cool, Mum. So. Anyway, and as one 17-year-old girl said, social media is a blessing and a curse, which is a pretty good summary, really. So smartphones first came in 2007, not that long ago. It's hard to imagine life without them. So about 15, 16 years ago, and there has been a real increase in the prevalence of depression and anxiety in young people over the last 10 years, last 15 years. Now, this is correlation, this is not causation, but I do think we should be looking at these trends and thinking about why that is. We know that young people who have mental health difficulties or who are vulnerable in some way are probably more vulnerable to the harmful effects of social media. So there's a kind of digital divide there. If you are a teenager who's relatively well-adjusted and resilient and so on, you're able to sort of manage when you see something difficult on social media, or you don't get sucked in the way that someone with a really vulnerable background or a background of abuse is obviously more likely to be a victim of grooming online, for example, because people prey on vulnerable people, and that's something we need to be aware of and wary of. There was this big NHS UK digital study which showed that the rates of probable mental disorders have increased really significantly over the last few years. So 1 in 6 young people in 2020 were thought to have a probable mental disorder, whereas back in 2017 it was 1 in 9. There are billions of users in the world, probably half the world's population. These figures are going up all the time. Many people don't go more than an hour without checking their phones. Probably, me talking about phones and social media is probably, I almost want to just put that down there. But it sort of makes you think about it, makes you wonder what's on there, makes you tempted to check it. And actually, when you look at the figures about how much we touch our phones during the course of the day, it's quite startling. And young people are particularly affected, and another study suggested that they spend over 10 hours a day online. And Anne Longfield, who I've met a couple of times, she's a lovely lady. She was the Children's Commissioner in the UK, and she said that children will be angry looking back at the wild and dangerous online world that they were exposed to. So, I think there's a lot of truth in that. We have a duty of care to young people as adults, as society, and we're not protecting them properly. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a little while. But it is a kind of Wild West out there, and we need greater regulation. I remember Peter Levine saying, in the first day, let's make it illegal, some of these harmful images. It's not straightforward, and I will talk about that, but we should be protecting young people better than we are. And if you think about, what would be, if parents left a pornographic magazine on their dining room table for their sort of 10-year-old child to have a look at, that would be safeguarding. That would, people would be concerned about that. Whereas we allow them to look at it on their phones, or we don't prevent that. So, pornography is a big topic, and can be used in a healthy way as well. But I think young people are seeing things that they really shouldn't see, and which can be. Once you've seen certain things, you can't unsee them. So we need to be thinking about that. So we have this business model in our society, and Facebook and other organizations promote this, which encourage young people to post photos and videos and then be just rated across the globe in terms of likes and comments. And we've never had that before. 15 years ago, we didn't have that. Now we have that. So it's almost like a huge experiment with our young people that we're doing. And it's something we need to be aware of and cautious about. And I do think that profit has come before young people's mental health and welfare. I don't think there's really any doubt that these large social media companies want our attention. They want us to click on links. They want, once we've started, they want us to keep doing that. And they want to make money out of our data and so on. So, and I don't think they hesitate to get young people into that as well. Facebook are developing a messenger app for 8-year-olds, and they're just going for younger and younger children, really trying to get them into using social media. Frances Haugen, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, brave woman, whistleblower, back in October 21. She worked for Facebook. She was very senior with them. And she commented, there was a big hearing in the States, and she commented that Facebook put astronomical profits before people. And Instagram is kind of like cigarettes for under 18s in terms of its addictive qualities. And they have specific algorithms that that lead teenagers from healthy eating content sometimes to anorexia-related content. So I've spoken to quite a few of these executives, and they said, we won't do that, we don't do that, we're going to stop doing that, et cetera, et cetera. But it's still happening. And, like any organization, I'm sure there's some very motivated, caring people in senior positions who do want to change things, and I think there are probably others who are very profit motivated, and things are really not changing as fast as they need to, and we do need to regulate better, and I'll talk about the Online Harms Bill in the UK in a little while. And Facebook know this information. They've done their own research, and they try to hide it actually as well. They didn't want to publish some of it. They said in internal memos and internal presentations, we make body image issues worse for 1 in 3 girls. And teenagers blame Instagram for increases in the rate of anxiety and depression. If you ask teenagers about this, they will say this, and that's consistent across all groups. So, really concerning. The Five Rights Foundation is a really good organization. There's a woman called Baroness Kidron in the House of Lords in the UK who founded this foundation, and they talk about, they've done a lot of research in this area, and they're also lobbying politicians and trying to help change the law to protect young people more. And they say that Facebook's own research is a devastating indictment of how carelessly the tech sector how Facebook and the tech sector more broadly treats children. And she said that Facebook is buying its profit with our safety, which is quite concerning. And more scrutiny of its algorithm is needed with greater transparency. So I mentioned about the algorithm where, if you Google anorexia, you can get led on to sites which kind of promote anorexia, other young people with anorexia who are encouraging you to be better anorexics and so on. And they need to really think about how they're managing these algorithms. If you Google self-harm, I've certainly heard, even on Amazon and things like that, you can get directed to sites that will sell you knives or sell you paracetamol. So, that is just outrageous. That should absolutely not be happening. And, if you do search self-harm or depression or low mood or whatever, you should be led to sites to do with, support and psychoeducation and where you can get some help. That's not happening in the way that it should be. They say it's going to happen more. We'll have to see what happens there. So these are some of the dangers of the web. I've obviously been talking about this already, but just some figures. A good 1 in 10 children in the last year have seen something that's really disturbed them online. Nearly 2/3 of young people, and again, these are figures from surveys and research. I suspect a lot of these numbers are lower than the reality. Nearly 2/3 of children have met offline with someone that they'd contacted online without their parents' knowledge. So there's something kind of secretive about the internet, and people, don't talk to their parents about what they're up to. And obviously that's pretty concerning. I mean, I know people meet each other and form relationships, and there can be good things that can happen online. But when it's a young person meeting an adult who might have initially pretended to be younger than they were, I don't need to tell you about the kind of concerns that could lead to. Individuals with a history of self-harm were more likely to be groomed by paedophiles and meet up with the paedophiles in person. And then there's suicide sites, which will, they will tell you what's the most effective way of killing yourself. There was actually a news item a few weeks ago, a guy in Canada who was sending packets of poisonous substances around the globe, and a very good BBC reporter actually uncovered this, and it did make you wonder, why on earth are the police not going after this guy? I mean, the police are not always that good at sort of coordinating between different countries, and what's online it must feel like a massive kind of well to them to sort of try and navigate and police. But anyway, there was this BBC reporter who met this guy and, doorstepped him with a microphone and say, I understand you're sending out poison in envelopes to people that, request it, and people are killing themselves with what you're sending. And he said, not my problem. I'm just meeting a demand. I'm not killing people. I'm not encouraging them to do that. So obviously that's really, worrying. And that is one case from the news in the last few weeks. And I hope that the police will catch up with him. I'm sure the BBC passed on their information about him. But there are these sites, and there are sites where they talk about catching the bus. And catching the bus, you can wait at the bus stop. So you go there, you wait at the bus stop, you talk to this is a virtual bus stop, you talk to other people who are at the bus stop who are thinking about whether to kill themselves or not. And then some people will, post, yeah, get on the bus, catch the bus. And, people get very perverse pleasures out of this, and it's really worrying. And of course, if you're a teenager, you're vulnerable. That is really concerning. There was a very well-known case, Molly Russell in the UK, who I'll come on and talk about her on the next slide. But after that, Instagram announced it would ban all graphic self-harm images in 2019. But there's still a lot of self-harm images on Instagram. So it's a little bit, you could argue, like that game Whack-A-Mole, where you push one thing down and something else pops up somewhere else. But I just don't think these social media companies are as motivated to change things as they should be. So Molly was a 14-year-old girl who was found dead in her bedroom. She had seen a lot of graphic self-harm images. She was obviously a vulnerable girl. She'd watched content related to depression and suicide online. And there's a kind of really toxic digital culture out there if you access it. I have met her father, Ian Russell. We were on a panel on TV together. He's a lovely man, and he is a real active campaigner for greater online regulation. He's transformed this tragedy and his obviously grief that won't leave him for the rest of his life into really trying to make a difference. And there's many other people like him as well out there. And the coroner, in her case, ruled that she didn't die from suicide. She died from an act of self-harm while suffering from depression and the negative effects of online content. So that was a coroner actually putting that in a legal document. I mentioned that online activity is often quite secretive. So over half of school children wouldn't tell their parents if they were upset about something online. And of course they would be worried that, if they said, I saw something really upsetting online, that their parent might say to them, well, we need to take your phone, or we need to limit it, or that would be a natural consequence that some parents might wish to follow through on. So that's partly why young people are kind of quite secretive. And they would tell, this survey of 10,000 pupils, they would tell their teacher if they were upset by something face to face. If someone tried to, bully them or groom them in some way, or say something really nasty to them, they'd be much more likely to tell a teacher if it was face to face, but only about a third might do that if they were upset by something online. So children are suffering in silence. There is this increase in mental health difficulties I've already referred to, and there's a huge increase in CAMHS referrals. Yesterday, a few of us were talking about this over in the exams hall, and we had an interesting discussion about why is there such an increase in CAMHS, child and adolescent mental health services. Why is there such an increase in referrals, and what can we do about it? That's beyond the scope of today, but there's definitely this correlation between increased use of social media and increased difficulties in mental health problems. We can't, however, confuse correlation with causation. So we can't say social media is definitely causing this. I don't think we've got the definite research evidence, but it's getting there more and more that there's a super clear correlation, and I think the studies will be there more and more to suggest that there is causation. And one of the things that we're lobbying for is that these social media companies should use a percentage of their profits towards research. So they make billions, and they could donate 2% of that, 1% of that, which would be a huge research budget for people to really investigate what is going on with young people and with social media in terms of the impact on their mental health. We don't have clear evidence from neuroscience studies that typical internet use harms the adolescent brain, and we do know that it's a mixed picture in some ways, that in terms of social interaction and empathy, it can actually enhance existing friendships and the quality of relationships. But there was this study in the BMJ which said that if you use social media to avoid social difficulties, you're likely to have reduced well-being, but it can also be used to deal with social challenges. For example, if you're neurodiverse and you make some nice connections online, that can be an example of how outcomes can improve. So it is a mixed picture, and I just want to mention briefly some of the advantages of access to internet and social media. Part of this talk and part of why I wanted to look into it is, so we can understand better as adults, as I was saying, and we need to help young people access the online space thoughtfully and responsibly. This is what one young person said about it: you can keep up to date with friends who you don't always see. And of course, there's that huge amount of information resources that are out there that young people and all of us have access to, which in many ways is a wonderful thing. When I was a teenager, we had Encyclopedia Britannicas around the house. Probably some of you will remember those. Took up like several shelves, and I used to get quite excited looking at them sometimes, but we've got it all in the palm of our hand now. It's quite amazing, really. And these are some of the disadvantages that I've already talked about, but I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail. I mean, cyberbullying, I'll just mention. In the past, when you were bullied at school, you could at least go home and maybe have a bit of peace and quiet when you're at home. But now it can follow you 24/7, and it can really interfere with your sleep, and it can lead to significant distress. I will talk about sleep in a little while, but while I was listening to Stephen Porges this morning talking about autonomic arousal and polyvagal theory, I was thinking about, a teenager who is looking at their phone in the middle of the night and gets some kind of critical comment, or gets, bullied, or someone says, you don't look good in that picture, whatever. The kind of autonomic arousal that could get stimulated, and then, your autonomic nervous system needs to be calm to sleep, so it interferes with your capacity to go to sleep, and we know that sleep and mental health are very closely interlinked. So these are the kind of pathways how social media can really interfere with mental health. Location services, I should mention as well. Young people are communicating with people who they don't necessarily know who they are, and they might have their location on, so that person who may wish them harm or to take advantage of them in some ways can work out where they are. So again, this is part of education, educating ourselves and young people. Turn off your location service unless you need it for a particular reason. Okay. This is a poll from the Girl Guides, quite a big survey, and again, teenage girls are just saying what I've already said, really. They worry about comparing themselves online, comparing their lives online with other people. Obviously, the bar online is quite high in some ways. images are photoshopped, people try and look their best, and then you look at yourself in the mirror and you don't feel you quite measure up. And that's particularly difficult perhaps for teenage girls, but it affects all of us. It affects teenage boys as well. And so this is what they're saying they really worry about. And they also worry about grooming. They worry about how photos they take could be altered and used out of context online. And they worry about how they look in photos. And their sense of self, they say this, is bound to the numbers of likes that they receive. And there's a group of us, quite a lot of people are sort of lobbying that images that are photoshopped in magazines and online should have a kind of kite mark on them and say this image has been photoshopped, and that's something that we would like to see more of, and that's part of protecting people online. People need to know that they've been altered, these images. So this is something about cyberbullying. I already mentioned that people probably would say a lot more behind a computer screen than they would in real life. And there was a big study by some colleagues at University College London and Imperial, which showed that social media damages children's mental health by ruining sleep, reducing their exercise levels, and exposing them to cyberbullies in their homes. So we're trying to understand more about how the effects are mediated, and that was a really good study in the last couple of years, and it's thought to be sleep, reduced exercise, and of course cyberbullying in your home is unhelpful. And I've already mentioned about sleep deprivation, but there is a strong association between social media use before bed and poor sleep quality. And if we're advising young people how they can minimize this, one way would be to suggest that they don't use a screen for at least an hour before bedtime, before they want to go to sleep. And we as parents and adults need to perhaps model that and monitor that. And one way might be in a household that all the members of the household put their phones in the kitchen charging together, a good chunk of time before bedtime. But that's just a suggestion. I know as a parent it's not always as easy to implement these suggestions. The LED lights on electronic screens can stop the natural processes in the brain that trigger the feeling of sleeplessness. So the screen, I know that phones have blue lights and they do in dark mode and things like that, but it does interfere with your melatonin release, and you need melatonin to fall asleep. So that's something we need to keep in mind. And lots of school students, they have their phone by their bedside, it pings during the night, and they check their phones, and if they see something that's worrying, it's not going to help them sleep. And this is the paper that I mentioned. It was published in The Lancet, Child and Adolescent Mental Health. And teenagers generally need more sleep than we do. They need, obviously it depends on the individual, but up to 10 hours a night. And it's a really important mediator in determining mental health, sleep. Cyberbullying I've talked about. Displacement of physical activity is problematic. So I have quite a few patients, some of them neurodiverse, on very, very into gaming. They want to be professional gamers in the future. They have these Grand Prix tournaments where you can win £1 million if you're like the best gamer in the world, and that's a kind of incentive for people to try and emulate. Of course, almost everyone won't be able to emulate that, but gamers, they can easily spend 14 hours a day online, and they're sitting there, they're not moving, so they're not physically active. And I have a patient, actually, quick anecdote, a boy who was really like that, and we managed to work together, and I helped him to get into fishing. He was neurodiverse, and he liked being on his own, and he liked relating to people via screen, but I just tried to find what else he might be interested in, and he just got very into fishing, and he finds it very peaceful, and he's met a little fishing community of people, and he now doesn't game nearly as much as he used to, and he fishes more. So I think we'll chalk that down to a little win. But displacement of physical activity is problematic, and this is demonstrated particularly for girls, but also for boys. Okay, self-harm. There's it's worrying what's online. People can be exhibitionistic about this. People can show images of their self-harm. People can be voyeurs. It can glamorize and romanticize self-harm sometimes. And some adolescents, they feel very lonely, they feel very isolated, they don't feel understood. And if they're in a group of people online who are self-harming, they might feel, this is my tribe, these are my people, at least they understand what I'm going through. But, other teenagers can be sometimes very helpful, but as you can imagine, they can sometimes be very unhelpful. So we need to be aware that this is going on online. And peers can, compete. There can be a badge of honor. I mean, I feel bad sort of standing here saying this, but, the deeper you cut, the more, you deserve a badge of honor, for example, and that absolutely is going on. And there's advice about how to do it. There are suicide pacts, people meeting online, and we need education and increased awareness of what's out there. In terms of eating disorders like anorexia, there's this phrase, thinspiration. You look at pictures of skinny models or skinny people, and they're your thinspiration. People talk about thigh gaps, which most people don't have thigh gaps, but these models sometimes have a thigh gap, and you want to have as big a thigh gap as possible, be as skinny as possible. And there can be competition and peer encouragement and tips that are out there. And Photoshop, I've already talked about that. But there are also really helpful websites like Beat, which is Beat Eating Disorders, and I recommend that one. I'll recommend some other websites at the end of the talk. There are these pro-anorexic websites, pro-ana websites, and they give you tips like, every time you think about food, snap a rubber band on your wrist, because food equals pain, and you shouldn't be thinking about food in a positive way. That spelling mistake is deliberate. I found that example online. Please, someone be my ana buddy. Be my buddy and help me be a better anorexic. And there's all sorts of rules. There's tips. People have league tables. How low is your weight this week? And they compare. Should they be taken down? Well, yeah, of course, we'd like to take them down, but it's impossible to fully control it. So we do need much better regulation, which I will come on and talk about. And there are these recovery websites as well. I know there's a lot of Americans in the audience, and I've looked at some of the recovery websites from the States as well, and in the UK. Some of them have a little bit of a religious aspect to them, but they are, some of them are really helpful. You can live your life free from an eating disorder. Recovery is possible. Positive stories of hope, although that last one I think is a little bit over the top. You can read that for yourself. The kind of thing that is out there. Okay. Pornography is a very, thorny issue that young people are accessing it more and more in the playground, and quite graphic images. I think we all know the kind of stuff that's out there. Some of it is less harmful than other aspects of it. It's quite easy to pretend you're someone you're not when you're online, so there's grooming going on. That's obviously a major safeguarding issue. People are meeting offline, I've already said that, when they meet someone online, and often the person is not who they said they were. And I'm sure many of you have heard of OnlyFans. The BBC did an investigation into this site, which is hugely popular. And lots of people are making money by posting, sexual images of themselves. If you're an adult, okay, you make your choices, but young girls are doing this, and underage girls are faking their ages. I came across one story where a 12-year-old used her grandmother's passport to get access to OnlyFans, to set up a website. They're not very well policed, and actually, these websites are really able to do proper age verification. If they put their minds to it, they absolutely could do it, but they're not doing it properly. And so, underage girls are posting explicit content, getting paid for it, getting into all sorts of difficulties. And actually, children who've been trafficked and abused are appearing on these sites. So it's deeply worrying. Sexting I've already talked about a little bit, but it is almost part of the sort of flirting ritual for young people. And it obviously carries risks that I've already sort of suggested, that images that should be private and were thought to be private don't end up being private. And of course that can be used to bully and control, and there's revenge pornography that you've probably heard of as well, goes on. And boys are putting, undue pressure on girls sometimes. Of course it can go the other way as well. And everyone's invited. If you Google that, that's in the last couple of years. My eldest daughter's 18, but she was quite involved in this, and I talked to her about the whole change in culture at her school. Her school was one of the ones that was kind of involved at an early stage in this, and basically it's about people putting online testimonies about what they've experienced, and it's really, really worrying what many teenage girls have suffered. Sexual violence, particularly at parties, people feeling, often it's boys, I don't want to over-stereotype things, but, boys feeling that they're entitled to touch girls or kiss them or whatever it is, and at a party, and, there's alcohol, there may be drugs, things happen, but it's, things happen that absolutely shouldn't be happening, and this is getting talked about more. And it was a Londoner, a woman called Soma Sara, a 22-year-old, who founded Everyone's Invited. And there is this kind of culture of silence and victim blaming as well, and I've definitely come across that. One of my daughter's friends made a complaint, was upset at school, and, to some extent, people say, did you ask for it a little bit? Why were you drunk? Or, whatever it is. So there's an element of victim blaming that can go on. And we need to help young people address the risk through open discussion and education. Just to say a little bit more about the addictive qualities of what's online, these companies deliberately manipulate the algorithms to increase our time spent online. You can Google dopamine labs if you want to. Swipe down, you can swipe down on something and then you get the next thing that comes. These online social media companies, they feed us what they think we want to know, what we want to see, and they also listen in on us. So, I was thinking about something recently, getting new paint to decorate a room kind of thing, and I was talking about that with a friend, and then, start getting adverts for paint. So they're kind of eavesdropping on us. Truth About Tech, hashtag Truth About Tech, you could have a look at that. And they do variable reinforcement, which is a behavioral technique to reinforce us using their platforms, automatic notifications, targeted content, etc., etc. I'm sure you're familiar with it. And do watch The Social Dilemma on Netflix if you haven't seen it. It's really, really interesting and a kind of salutary story about how they get us addicted. I have a friend who works in the substance abuse service for teenagers in central London. He said it's really hard to keep up. He works with this day in, day out. But, you can order drugs and they get delivered to you like pizza via Instagram, via Snapchat. There's this drug, Lean, which has become quite popular in the last year or so, in London anyway, which is codeine linctus, kind of cough linctus, and codeine and antihistamines all mixed up with a soft drink. So it tastes like Coca-Cola, but it's got opiates in it and it's got antihistamines in it, and you can get that in 5 minutes, order it on Snapchat. So what are some of the possible solutions that are out there? You can have family-friendly filters on devices, although often, the teenagers know more about it than the adults do, and you might have a go at disabling certain things and they will get round it. We talked a little bit yesterday about PSHE, Personal, Social, Health and Economic Education in schools, and the national curriculum does aim to teach young people about internet safety, and that is happening more and more, but obviously it's a variable quality, the teaching, but it is being spoken about more in schools. I think parents need to view the world through their children's eyes, and I hope this talk will sort of contribute to that a little bit, because, we don't, as adults, necessarily know what our children are seeing, and we need to be more aware of it. And of course, website providers need to police their sites more closely. I've mentioned Molly Russell already. There's also this this online platform, ourpact.com, if you want to check that one out. And the idea of that is that you can make a pact with your teenager, your son or your daughter, and say, let's just agree that we switch off the Wi-Fi in our house by 9 p.m. or whatever it is. And you make a pact, and it's kind of a two-way conversation, and then you can make that happen. And of course, as I already said, searches related to things like self-harm need to be, the users need to be directed to more positive resources, not to things that will actually encourage them to self-harm. There's also this concept of green time, which Oswald et al. Talked about. It's kind of like a counterbalance to screen time. It's time in nature, it's time outdoors, time getting some fresh air. High levels of screen time are associated with unfavorable psychological outcomes, and particularly children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are disproportionately affected by this. They might be living in areas where there's not nice parks on their doorstep, where they might be living in kind of concrete jungles or high rises, and it's harder for them to get out. But green time is definitely something that can buffer the consequences of high screen time. I'm conscious of time, and I do want to leave a few minutes for questions, so I'm just going to rattle through this online safety bill, which is something that our wonderful government are trying to get through, and they have been trying to do that since 2017. We've actually had 5 prime ministers and 5 ministers for digital health since 2017, so we're not doing terribly well. But this is a really important piece of legislation, and the UK have actually lost the opportunity to be global leaders in this, because when it first came out, I and others were sort of lobbying about it and talking about, let's have a nice, well, any legislation is not simple, but let's try and have a sort of straightforward piece of legislation that talks about the duty of care that these social media companies should have for young people. That, at the forefront of what they do should be looking after young people. This safety bill has become more and more complicated, and it's a huge document now, and it's still not legislation. But basically the idea is to try and make companies more responsible for their user safety online. They need to remove and limit the spread of illegal and harmful content. And Ofcom is the organization that's supposed to police this, but Ofcom, they don't have a huge amount of teeth. They try and police other things, and they don't do a brilliant job. So, the organization needs to have actual teeth. And the way they can have teeth is they need to have powers to fine, and they need to feel confident that politicians and others will back them if they fine, for example, Facebook 10% of their global turnover. That's a lot of money. So the idea is that they will be able to do that, but whether it will actually happen remains to be seen. And a deferred power that has been talked about is making senior managers criminally liable. So the CEO of Facebook or whoever, if people are accessing harmful content and harming themselves or ending their lives, then senior managers who've allowed this to go through should have, corporate manslaughter, these kind of things. But that's a deferred power. That may not be needed. And this is just a slide about the passage through Parliament. And there's a whole group of us that have been involved in trying to make this happen. Mental Health Foundation, Young Minds, Royal College of Psychiatrists. Just recently, it was the final committee stage in the House of Lords, and then the report stage. These are just various stages that you go through to try and get something actually into legislation. But, we're going to have an election next year. I really hope it does actually get in, but there's a lot of people arguing, certainly on the Tory backbenches, about free speech and, sort of spurious arguments in some ways. And there's this balance between free speech and protecting young people. So we're waiting for it to become an act still. 6 years later, started in 2017. COVID. Social media was helpful during COVID for many young people. Obviously, if you're isolating and you can stay in touch with your friends and you can FaceTime them or video them and stay in touch, it's obviously helpful, potentially. There was an anecdotal reduction in cyberbullying, many people said. And maybe, we can move towards viewing social media in a more positive way, but we have to regulate. China, a country that really does regulate. I was just hearing about this in the last month or so on the news. Over 1 billion social media users in China. It's obviously an authoritarian kind of country, but they have made regulations just literally in the last month that it's mandatory to build a children's mode into their apps, where children aged 8 to 15 are allowed up to 1 hour a day, and under 8 you're allowed up to 40 minutes a day. So they're very suspicious of tech in the way that probably we all will be by the end of this talk, and probably were anyway. But, that's debate. That's a political debate, basically, whether government should be doing that. But the government are aware of the risks of too much time on social media for young people. But they're also worried about, obviously democracy and spreading ideas that go against the prevailing norm in China. So I'm sure they've got mixed motivations for doing that. Big White Wall, I'm not going to talk about that because of time, but just check it out. It's a good organization. It's something that's kind of positive that's out there. You can build a brick and you can put your emotions on the brick and you can get other people commenting on the wall that it's kind of a creative thing that's online, and there's wall guides, you can access people for counseling, and people do well on that, young people do well on that. That's just one example of what's out there that's quite positive. And this is something about information and online resources. So Kooth.com is increasingly being used in the UK Health Service, online counselling support. I slightly worry that, in the interest of saving money, we're sending more and more young people with quite significant mental health problems to online resources. But on the other hand, if we can improve the online resources, that is a good thing. you can check all those out. There's a guide for parents about staying safe online. If you want to make a report about things that are concerning, you can go to the Internet Watch Foundation. Goodthinking.uk is a site I often recommend to my patients. It's just got a lot of good positive resources on there about mental health. MindEd is from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. It's got information for clinicians, parents and young people, and Five Rights Foundation I mentioned already. This Shout tech support was launched by the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge in 2019, and that's a free tech service for anyone in crisis. It's mainly used by 14 to 24-year-olds. It's confidential and anonymous. You can also look at the website, giveusashout.org. But basically, 24/7, you just text Shout to 85258, and you get a response usually within 5 minutes, and then you can have a text conversation with someone, and they will point you to the right kind of support, and they will offer support, and that can be at 3 in the morning, so that's a useful resource. Just to conclude, there's this phrase, the genie is out of the bottle, so we can't put the genie back in the bottle, we can't turn back time. So we need to understand what is out there as adults. We need to understand the seriousness of what young people are being exposed to. We need to inform ourselves, we need to educate, monitor, discuss openly. We need to think about appropriate boundaries in respect to social media. As I've already suggested, I'm aware that it's not always easy to police, but for example, no phones in the bedroom at night. And mental health can really be harmed, as I'm sure I've conveyed to you in the last hour or so, but there can also be helpful aspects. And I think we should try and focus more on the message than the medium. I mean, just say social media is bad is, I think, way too simplistic. There's really positive stuff on social media, and there's really unhelpful stuff as well. So let's focus more on the message. And of course, it can be good to disconnect, to connect. And there is an example of behavioral rewards gone wrong. Okay. All right. Well, thank you for listening. And we've got about 5 or 10 minutes. I think we started 5 minutes late, so maybe we've got 10 minutes for questions and comments. Is there a mic somewhere?
Hello. Hello.
Okay. Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah.
Can
Do you want to
hear me?
introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Max Daldamöller from Somerset. I work in education and I'm a therapist as well.
Yeah.
This has been a topic that I've been working with for several years. I'm very, very interested. I actually did some talks up and down the country, including Glastonbury Festival, on this topic in 2019, pre-pandemic. One of the things, I really appreciate your talk, very informative, and I found myself often kind of saying all these things that are wrong with the social media companies, kind of almost looking at somebody else to solve that problem. But I've also become aware of what I can do as an individual in terms of my own personal responsibility, and I think that as adults is actually what kind of model are we providing to our children when I've got my precious here hanging from my neck. How much time do I spend online? What model am I giving to my own children, to other children, about how we are with this? So I put this into place, but I went and engaged in a digital detox. I did as a little experiment, a heuristic inquiry, and I'm currently doing a master's and I'm researching digital detoxes because I understand how difficult it is to give up your phone. I understand what is it like to live in the 21st century Western world without one of these. And so I'm looking at, just putting out there, if anybody wants to volunteer to take part in a digital detox and an interview before and after, please hit me up after this.
Okay.
So yes, just wanted to put that out.
Do you want to say your name again?
Max Daldamöller.
Okay, wonderful, thanks for that. I think digital detox is a great idea.
Yeah.
If I ever go on holiday and there's no Wi-Fi and things like that, it's actually quite a relief. It's nice. Okay, who's next? Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, has the mic gone to someone else?
It's here. I'm moderating for online participants, so I'm just gonna read the question from the first
Okay, you do the question, then we'll go to this lady here
and then
next.
we can, yeah, okay, cool. So there are a lot of positive comments saying like, really grateful for the content and details. There's one question about your email, which I can see it's here now, so that's resolved. There's one question on regarding the data you present on iPad use and other screen time or online time, does that include time used in classroom learning, and whether there might be different outcome regarding the purpose of use, such as learning or teletherapy and stuff like that? And if so, how can larger society promote a more positive use of tech and reduce the risk factors to like children being manipulated?
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about that Royal College of Pediatrics survey, they were talking about, more positive things as well as less helpful things. So, of course, in classrooms across the country, people are using iPads, screens for really positive educational purposes as well. So I just think it's a mixed picture. And how do we promote that? Well, I mean, I've kind of made some suggestions, but that's a problem for our society. We want to use tech in a more positive way, and we want to manage the negative aspects. And I've made some suggestions. I think it's Bessel said politics comes into everything, and I would agree with that. I think politics is a really important part. We need to be thinking about what kind of society we have, and managing the negative stuff that's out there. Do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. I've really appreciated this talk today as someone who is young and chronically online.
Yeah.
Well, more just chronically online, not in a social aspect. I have built my whole business and my work online being a young person. So for me, social media, I do see a lot of the positive sides of social media. And so I was happy to see today that that was mentioned and spoken about. And obviously the negatives are so prominent. But there is this whole amazing community, as we alluded to on here, of people out here doing the work to build positive spaces out here. And I feel like sometimes it does get overcast with obviously the outright awful things that are happening. But as you said, focusing on those parts more than just the negatives as well. But as we were kind of going, I suppose mine's more of just sharing more than a question, perhaps something to think about, of just how with these apps and these social medias, as much as we can kind of sit and, I don't know, look inwards and kind of at ourselves and how children are and young people are, of knowing what we're up against with these apps and with these social media platforms. When you think back into COVID, of how, particularly on Instagram, you'd post something, anything to do with COVID, immediately a pop-up message came up saying, this may not be correct information, healthcare, whatever it may be. So if an app can find that just through you using the word COVID, coronavirus, it makes you think, why are they not doing that with anything with anorexia, racism, anything like that, if they don't want to. And that is the part, is that we are all just consumers and users, and if they do start putting these things in place of, yes, we're going to block these words and whatever it may be, they're not money makers.
Yeah.
We have more questions in short time.
Yeah, of course. But just, thank you. And just as professionals, to find the work online and the people who are doing the amazing work, so that whenever your clients and people coming to your doors, you know where to send them to, rather than just saying it's the big bad dark web.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Agree. Should we go with that lady up there?
Yeah, I'll be there.
Has someone got the mic? Yes,
Yes.
you and then... Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Hello, can everybody hear?
Yeah.
So my name's Selina Sass. So I run a charity supporting people in prison through trauma-informed practice. So I'm not a therapist, but we do therapeutic type work. Now, I was just interested to ask you, John, because one of the big issues for people in prison who've, been criminalized, part of it through online activity, potentially. Let's start with the youth justice system. Do you have any experience of how those children are being helped digitally whilst they're in prison?
I personally don't. It's an interesting question, though. I did work in a prison a long time ago, but that was with adults. So, yeah, I don't know. But, I mean, that's part of how society can kind of improve things. I mean, in prisons, they can be actually quite, you've got a captive audience, haven't you? So, you can actually really support young people with good education and resources in prison if you put the resources in there. The trouble is, you know, the reality is lots of teenagers, lots of adults in prison have just been locked up in their cells for, you know, 22 hours a day. So I think there's potential for really doing some good work there, but I don't think it's happening at the moment, is
All
my
right.
impression.
Thank you, John. I might put you in touch with, we work with someone who's in charge of the Youth Justice Board. And
Okay.
it just feels like this is really important work.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Shelley from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in the United States. I'm
Hi.
a therapist there. And I wanted to talk about a problem with lack of veracity of online information.
Yeah.
There's a lot of information that I call junk food for the mind. And people can't tell what's really legitimate resource and what is just anything anybody wants to make up. The other thing I want to mention about is the way that the media accelerates problems that exist. Young people with gender issues, confusion, you know, young people having to deal with where they come from, where it used to be that parents were divorced. Now it's they maybe have been conceived through in vitro fertilization, and they've got to deal with not knowing who their father is. So I think that kind of thing gets accelerated, and gender issues get accelerated through social media and pressurized. And the other thing I want to say is the whole issue of artificial intelligence and virtual reality. You know, in our country now, there's a big talk about AI and where that's going to go with people, and not being able to tell what's real, what's not real, what's true,
Yeah, another
up,
huge
down,
issue.
around,
Yeah.
and about. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to talk about AI and upcoming.
I don't have a lot to say about AI right now, but I think it's something that we need to be, you know, paying close attention to. No, we need to be paying close attention to it. I mean, you're alluding to politics as well in sort of some of the fake information that's out there. It's a big problem. It's a big problem. I think we're aware of it. I think we've got time for one more question, really. Yeah. Do you want to go? Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, is there someone over there as well? Should we have two more questions then? Is that okay? All right, let's start with you then, if you had the mic. Sorry, I didn't see.
That's all right. Hi, my name's Amber Newman. I work as a one-to-one supporter for a suicide prevention charity in Oxfordshire, and we do a lot of group work with the local schools. And we've been asked by a local secondary school to run some workshops on social media, which are due in 2 weeks, and I haven't written yet. So I'm really glad to be attending this. But one of the things that sort of came out of a steering group we did with young people is actually that a lot of the time they feel like their parents are being very hypocritical because they're posting all of the young person's stuff online without their consent, so baby photos, stuff like that. And particularly, like, even my age, so I'm only 23, and I noticed that a lot of people my age having children, like, you look on and suddenly someone's on Facebook talking about the fact that kid's got a rash, and what do I do? So I just wondered if you've got any sort of opinions about that one, but also any opinions on what sort of you think the effect of that is going to have with young people, because it is a big issue and people aren't really speaking about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. And, you know, I mean, my daughters are very clear that I don't put pictures of them online unless they give me permission, and usually they don't give me permission. So I'd like to do it a bit more than they let me. But I think that's up to the individual, and I think when you're doing it of young children who, you know, can't consent, it's a little, you need to think about it, and once it's on there for good. So, you know, I mean, of course it's an innocent thing to share a nice picture of your little baby or something, but you should be aware that we all have a digital imprint, and, you know, I say this to teenagers I work with, and I say this to my kids as well. You know, when you post that picture, you know, of you and, you know, maybe not, you know, wearing a bikini or something, you might not necessarily want that seen in sort of 5 or 10 years' time by your employer or future, or if you post a picture of you looking a little bit drunk at a party, that kind of thing. So I just think we need to be aware of that, and it's out there. And I think a lot of employers kind of look people up online, you know, before they recruit them, and they see things that they don't like, and then you don't get the job. So something to be aware of, for sure. And I'm conscious of time. Let's make this the last question. Thank you.
Very small comment.
Yeah.
While you've looked at one end of the age spectrum, very young adults, I'm aware as a therapist in Australia, I've been consulted about older people who have been scammed and lost their life savings, and one has actually sold her house to give it to somebody who has been posing on the net as some young lover. So there need to be some, and I wonder if you could point me to some resources, because obviously, while the government tries to help, you can't interfere with that person's Facebook or whatever page where they're being scammed.
Yeah. I've been scammed, actually. I got scammed out of thousands of pounds, and I managed to get it back via the ombudsman from my bank. But it's, you know, I think I'm a fairly smart person. I'm not particularly naive, but you can get scammed really easily. Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, well, that's then they need, you know, they need some mental health support, obviously, as well. But in terms of resources, I just happen to know that, you know, Which is an organisation which sort of talks about consumer rights and things like that. They've got material online about scamming and how to prevent it. But you're right, and my mother's been phoned up. You know, she's in her 80s. She's been phoned up by people pretending to, pretending to be a doctor and things like that. People are very vulnerable. And just in the last few weeks, I've had a phone call, and I know it was a scam. They pretend to be your bank or whoever they are. So we all need to be really careful about that. But that's another kind of whole topic as well. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone.